Hi, welcome to this lecture. In the last lecture, I have explained about how Azure internally works at a data center level. In this lecture, I'm going to explain about how Azure resources are organized and accessed. Okay, so let's go into these details. In terms of Azure resources, the lowest common denominator is Azure resource. A resource is an entity that is managed by Azure. It can be virtual machine, it can be virtual network, it can be storage account. And each resource in Azure must belong to a resource group. Resource group is a logical entity that will group the resources so that you can manage all the resources in resource group as a single entity. Most of the time, you will put the resources that share the common life cycle into a particular resource group. And each resource group must belong to a subscription. And subscription is almost like a resource group, but I would say it's more like a billing entity. All the costs of the resources in resource groups under that particular subscription will be aggregated at a subscription level, and also you can apply a lot of controls at a subscription level. For example, resource policies. A policy is basically a set of rules that you can apply and make sure all the resource groups and subscriptions are compliant to that policy. For example, let's say you want to avoid deploying storage accounts into the resource groups that belong to this subscription. Then you can define a policy and apply the policy so that nobody will be able to deploy storage accounts into the resource groups under that subscription. By the way, resource policies can be applied at resource group level also. And in addition to policies, you can apply resource limits, and also you can apply financial limits at Azure subscription level. And each of these Azure subscription can belong to a management group. Management group is at enterprise level, and you can define governance rules at a management group level and apply them so that all the subscriptions and resource groups under that management group will inherit that governance rules. For example, let's say you want to limit your users deploying the resources into a particular region. So for example, your company is existing in US and UK, and you want to avoid people deploying the resources into Australia or Europe or India. In that case, you can define a policy at a management group level so that people will not be able to deploy resources into other regions other than US and UK. Okay. And in the previous lecture, I have explained about a piece of software called Orchestrator, which contains all the front-end services, such as web services, REST APIs. One of the components of that Orchestrator is Azure Resource Manager, which will contain REST APIs, which can be called by different tools exist in Azure, such as PowerShell, Azure Portal, or Azure CLI, in order to deploy the resources into subscriptions and resource groups. Okay. However, this Azure Resource Manager won't contain the complete functionality. It's just an umbrella. For example, once a request came to Azure Resource Manager to deploy a virtual machine, it will identify the resource type is virtual machine, and it will delegate that request to an appropriate Azure resource provider. In this case, virtual machine, and Azure resource provider will manage or deploy the resource. Okay, so the request initially will come to Azure Resource Manager. Azure Resource Manager will identify the resource type and pass on the request to Azure resource provider, and resource providers such as virtual network or virtual machine or app service will carry out the transaction, whether it is managing that particular resource or deploying that particular resource. So what is this Azure Resource Manager does then? It does two important things. First one is it will authenticate the user. For that purpose, Azure Resource Manager has a trust built with Azure Active Directory. Azure Active Directory is a multi-tenanted Active Directory, and it contains tenants. A tenant is basically a logical construct of dedicated instance of Azure Active Directory for a particular organization generally. Okay, so when you create an Azure account, a tenant will be created to you, and you can deploy the users into that tenant, and also you can define role-based access control for that users in that particular tenant. So Azure Resource Manager first of all authenticates the user, and the second thing it will do is it will check the authorization level of the users also, because you will define role-based access control between the users and resources. So you can go to a subscription or resource group, or within Azure AD itself, you can define what resources will be accessed by a particular user by defining groups and adding that particular user into a group. just like Windows AD. And when Azure Resource Manager gets a request through Azure portal or PowerShell, the first thing it will check is authenticate the user, whether it is a valid user or not. And the second thing it will check is whether the user has authorization level in order to deploy or manage that resource. Okay, so this is how Azure resources are organized, and also the access check happens in Azure. And secondly, most of the time, if your company is big enough, you'll go with enterprise agreement. In that case, you will get access to enterprise portal where you can have a hierarchy of enterprise and you can define business units under that enterprise. It can be finance, HR, operations, and you can create Azure accounts or tenants under that business unit. So you can have a dedicated AD tenant for finance, dedicated AD tenant for HR. And you start creating subscriptions under the tenants. Okay, so this is how you will organize at a highest level if you go with enterprise agreement. But from that point onwards, everything is same in terms of what I have shown you in the previous slide. So I hope you got good understanding of how Azure resources are organized, and also how the access is controlled, and also how hierarchy looks like when you go with enterprise agreement. So that's it for this lecture. In the next lecture, I'm going to provide you 10,000 feet view of all Azure services available in Azure. Basically, I'm going to divide them into categories like storage, network, and compute, and I'm going to provide you a glimpse of what Azure services are available in those areas. It is going to be a very interesting lecture. So if you have some time, join me in the next lecture.